Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Joining us now to speak on the budget implementation and performance of the 2018 budget and the 2019 budget when it's eventually signed into law by the President is Director General of the Budget of the Federation, Ben Akabueze. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, you are welcome to the morning show. Thank you for honoring our invitation. I'm sure many of our viewers out there have a lot of questions.
My pleasure.
Yes, about budgeting process. But let's start with, budget performance, implementation. I mean, every year, what we get to hear is that budget performance is very low. And the heads of the various MDAs, when they appeared before the committees on appropriation at the National Assembly, they were complaining about, their line items not being cash backed. What is the guarantee that with this 2019 budget, that the budget will be implemented faithfully?
Well, every budget is designed with a view to achieving its full implementation or as close to full implementation as possible. But as you know, a budget represents an estimate, albeit a well-informed one. And there are two sides to the budget. You have the revenue side and you have the expenditure side. And therefore, what happens to the expenditure side depends to a critical extent on what happens on the revenue side. When the projected revenues don't materialize, it becomes nigh impossible for the expenditure side to be fully realized, especially in a situation where we are already running a deficit budget, which means that ab initio, it is understood that the revenues will not suffice, and therefore there is a plan to borrow to augment the revenues. So when when the budget is passed by the National Assembly, which makes it law, that law imposes a ceiling on how much you can borrow to fund that budget. Therefore, if it turns out that your revenue projections are fully met, and then you can borrow all to the limit that has been approved for you, there is no reason, therefore, why the expenditure side cannot be met. But then, even on the expenditure side, you have, broadly speaking, recurrent expenditures and capital expenditures. And there is also a category of expenditures called statutory expenditures, which, statutory transfers, especially to the other arms of government, the legislature, the judiciary. Whether or not your revenue projections are met, every month you must transfer to those other arms of government 1/12 of what is represented in the budget for them. There are other critical areas as well, like security, where regardless of what happens, you've got to fund in full. So, but when people talk about low performance of the budget, and everybody is right to be concerned about that, that concern really revolves around the capital expenditure side. Because the recurrent expenditures, salaries are paid, monthly, pensions are paid, other, obligations necessary to keep government running are paid. And so when people look at the capital side and use that as a complete determinant of how, the budget has performed, it's not quite so. So the capital expenditure budget, for instance, for 2018, has been overall, cash backed about 60%. But then on the recurrent side, it's near 100%. A significant part of our budget is also the provisions for debt service. That has to perform 100%. We've met all our obligations as and when they fall due. So when you actually then aggregate all of this, the aggregate performance of the budget is not as low as people make out. The aggregate performance of the budget is closer to 80%.
What is the role of the process of budget preparation? Because there have been calls for a review in the budget cycle, to January to December cycle, and there have been assurances from the Buhari administration that this will be so. But yet again, we find ourselves in May. The National Assembly has just passed the budget. So we are continuing that pattern of the appropriation bill being signed into law in June. And how does this affect budget performance? Because you've listed a variety of factors just now, but you have not addressed the issue of the budget cycle that we have.
Obviously, I mean, you're right, without a doubt. Late, approval of the budget does impact performance, especially performance of the capital expenditure side. Don't forget that since January this year, salaries for 2019 have been paid. Other bills, utility bills and stuff like that necessary to keep government running have been paid. The security agencies have been, doing their job. All of these are essentially still, so in effect, the 2019 budget has been in operation. The Constitution has what we call the provisional budget clause, which allows us, even before, the budget is passed, to spend up to 50% of what was appropriated in the previous year. But then, because capital expenditure is appropriated in specifics, we cannot assume that because there was an approval to spend money on a road last year, that there will be a similar approval to spend on that particular road this year. And therefore, on the capital expenditure side, we do not spend until the budget is signed into law, and we know exactly what has been approved. And so that's also a contributory factor to the lower performance on the capital budget side. The truth is, this has now become, the last several years now, we haven't been able to, for indeed quite a long time, we haven't been able to have a budget ready by the month of January. What needs to happen to get that? Everybody, the executive, the legislature, we're all agreed on the necessity to return the country to a predictable fiscal year where everybody who engages with this country, everybody who does business in this country, because despite the fact that government is not necessarily in aggregate, the private sector spends much more money than the government. But, government expenditure, has a great signaling effect in terms of the direction that the economy is going. And so private sector tends to take their lead from, government's, budget. And that's why it's critical that we get back to a predictable cycle. So the private sector and all other people who do business with the country can plan, better. But everybody is agreed on the necessity of it. Somehow we haven't been able to, to make it happen. And it requires collaboration on both sides. The National Assembly argues, understandably, that to be able to pass the budget by the end of December, they need to get the budget by the end of September. And that's great. But you see, if we only get a budget passed in May, it's very difficult to have the budget for the next period ready before September. On the average, it takes a 6-month cycle from the start of the process to the end to complete a budget preparation, the work on budget preparation. Remember, there are over 1,000 budget units, agencies of government that we have to prepare budgets for. And so in a year where we all agree on the necessity to return the country to a January-December cycle, there has to be compromises on both sides. Everybody needs to understand difficulties, and we work together to basically get this done. And there'll have to be some transitional arrangements, but once we we do that in one particular year, then we can get back to this thing. And I'm a supporter of legislation. Let's have legislation in place. There's been an organic budget law, pending, but of course, that law includes a budget calendar, which will mandate everybody, the executive, the legislature, to complete, their own part of the job by a certain time. However, there's a challenge with that because the Constitution, we need some amendment to the Constitution before that law can be passed, because the Constitution doesn't impose such a time limit. The Constitution simply says that the president must present a budget before the end of December. So if the president presents a budget on the 31st of December, he has satisfied the requirement of the Constitution as it stands now. And so, that constitutional provision needs to be amended, because if it doesn't happen someday in future, even if you pass the budget, law, someday in future, a president who doesn't feel inclined to obey that law may wake up and say that, look, the Constitution is superior, and the Constitution gives him the latitude to present the budget as.
Let's talk about your revenue target for the 2019 budget. How feasible is this? I mean, the oil benchmark at $60 per barrel seems safe at the moment because oil prices are oscillating at between $69 and $70 per barrel. However, the oil production target has never been met. And once again, it seems unrealistic with the 2.3 million liters, 2.3 million liters barrel per day that you have proposed. Is this not unrealistic?
Well, it's interesting that, 5 months ago, you all were shouting about the oil price itself being unrealistic, the quantity projection being unrealistic. You all basically wrote off the revenue projections as dead on arrival. It's interesting how time changes things. Now you acknowledge that we were right on the price projection. I think you should wait also for the end of the year to see whether or not we're right on the quantity projections. But 2.3 million barrels wasn't a number pulled from the sky. We have the technical capacity to produce 2.5 million barrels per day. There have been challenges. The security challenges. There were challenges with respect to the safety and integrity of the pipeline network for even evacuating the crude after it's been produced. There's funding challenges in the past. What we have sought to do is try to address these challenges. We need to produce as much oil as we can while we still can. Everybody acknowledges that this is a wasting asset. The days of fossil fuels are numbered. Nobody knows how much longer. So it's in our interest as a country that we produce as much as possible of it while we still can, make economic use of it. And so that's why, we've challenged everybody involved to say, what are your constraints? Let's fix the constraints so we can produce these 2.3 million barrels, which we need to be able to, to fund the ever-growing needs of this economy. So I think that rather than this fixation with a discussion around whether it's realistic or unrealistic, let's have the right conversation, which is, one, do we need to produce 2.3 million barrels? Absolutely, and even more. The question, can we? The answer is yes. What do we need to do? Let's focus the conversation around what we need to do. So if there are people who need to, to do more in securing the pipelines, let's call them out. The president has given, marching orders to NNPC to do whatever they have to do to ensure that the 2.3 million barrels per day, production is met. The numbers that we get from NNPC says they're currently doing over 2.1 million barrels. Let's see. But again, thankfully, we have a cushion on price. You yourself said the price for crude is currently averaging about 69. that means we are more than 10%, we are 15% over on the price. If at the end of the day, instead of 2.3 million barrels, we actually end up with 2.1, for instance, we will be 10% down on volume. If we're 10% down on volume and 15% up on price, we would still meet our revenue projections, because at the end of the day, your revenue projection is your price times your quantity. So let's all stay focused on the right conversation.
Quickly, let me take you up on this matter. The National Assembly, in passing the 2019 budget, increased deficit financing with about 90 billion naira, and their excuse is that they've had to accommodate certain items that the president did not include in the proposal, like severance package for lawmakers and their aides, the security situation in Zamfara State, orientation and induction for members of the Ninth National Assembly, and so on and so forth. What's your reaction to that deliberate decision to increase the deficit financing? And then another major concern every year is this, inclusion in the budget of items that some people have said, appear frivolous or suspicious. For example, some of the budgeting units, every year, they talk about money for cutlery, they talk about money for the kitchen, they talk about, all kinds of things. And Nigerians keep wondering, why are some of these budgeting units buying computers every year, buying cutlery every year, devoting so much funds to entertainment and so on?
Well, let me begin with the adjustments that the National Assembly is said to have made. As we speak, we have not received the details of what they passed from the National Assembly. And the usual process is that when they pass the budget, they communicate the details to the president, who passes them on to us, and we then match what they have passed to what was sent, and then try to understand the rationale for the changes and what needs to be done to be able to implement them where they are implementable. So until we receive that, I'm afraid I'm constrained to be able to comment exactly. I mean, I've read, if you go by just what's in the media, I've read some people, National Assembly increases the budget by 10 billion. You hear all kinds of numbers. But if you go by the new number that, the total, the difference is 90 billion. But we don't know. 90 billion naira may be a net number. It may well be that the adjustments are much more than that. Some things may have been, taken out. Some things may be added. And, 90 billion is just a net number. So until we get that, the details, I'm not able to comment. The other part of your question, which has to do with what people often describe as repetitive and frivolous items. People often on the one hand, you talk about the fact that the budget doesn't perform 100%. And then on the other hand, you talk about repetitive provisions. The reality is that some of those items that you find repeating themselves, sometimes because they are considered low priority items, they are the last to get funding. And so because the budget doesn't perform 100%, we don't get to them. And so all that happens is the agencies are asked to move them to the following year. If the following year we're able to get to them, then they happen. If not, they keep moving forward. That's one explanation. The other explanation is this: because resources are constrained. If an agency has a need for 200 computers, we may be able to say to them, well, sorry, we cannot afford to fund 200 computers for you in 1 year. We will be able to fund only 50 computers in a year. What that means is that year one, you will see 50 computers in the budget of that agency. Year 2, you will see 50 computers in the budget of that agency. Year 3, you will see 50. Year 4, you will see 50 computers. But that's not repetitive. That's 200 computers bought over 4 years. So before you make conclusions about whether an item is, flawless or it's repetitive, just ask us. I mean, we have, on the website of the Budget Office, we have a citizens portal. Go on there, post your question. We'll give you the answers, and rather than rush to, conclusions when you may not have, all of the facts. It's people often make whatever talk about entertainment. If you aggregate all of the provisions for what you call entertainment, they don't even add up to 0.000 whatever % of the budget. The entire provision in the budget for overheads of government in the 2018 budget, for instance, was 246 billion naira. 246 billion naira was less than 3% of the total budget size. That's the entire overhead, whatever. So even if you saved the overhead and made the overhead zero, and the principal components of these overheads are things like utilities, power, and cost, and all of that, to be able to keep the government running. So people talk about cost of government and cost of. If you made overheads zero, it doesn't amount to significant savings.
You've identified as a factor in the shortfall of revenue accruing to the federal government the failure of federal government organizations to remit 2.8 trillion naira. What measures are you undertaking for a more effective recovery?
Well, my office is currently engaging with the affected agencies to get to the root of it. And government is determined to take actions. The president has given directives that all agencies must remit what is due to the federation account, and there will be consequences for those who fail, to do so.
Well, with domestic revenue generation underperforming at this time and the plans to implement a lean budget, one will wonder why the federal government is shying away from the issue of subsidy removal. And also, we understand that the new minimum wage has been catered for in the 2019 budget. You were a member of the Technical Advisory Committee set up by President Muhammadu Buhari on the new national minimum wage. What are some of the recommendations you came up with to ensure that we do not borrow so much as to fund this budget, especially as it regards the inclusion of the new minimum wage?
Well, let me start with the committee on the minimum wage. The report has been submitted to the government, and it is, the government will make the recommendations, public, when it deems it necessary to do so, and that's a process that is currently ongoing. So I'm afraid it will be difficult for me, therefore, here to, even though, yes, I was, I was a secretary, a member secretary of that committee, so I know all of those. But broadly speaking, the recommendations about new initiatives, initiatives for raising revenues, for cutting costs where, feasible. So that's what they are broadly. But government needs to look at this, take position, and communicate. I don't want to, when you start banding the recommendations around, because for now they remain recommendations. But I assure you, there's not much in those recommendations that is totally novel. Okay. So that's the other question you asked was about removal of subsidy. Mm-hmm. Well, again, this is a matter that is under consideration. What we have, let me make some clarification, because right now we had a situation where the current administration had made some adjustment in petroleum price. First of all, when we talk about petroleum products here, we're talking about just petrol, or what's called premium motor spirit, PMS, because all other products have been deregulated. Kerosene, jet fuel, diesel. There's no those products have been deregulated. So it's only about petrol that we're talking here, where there is a 145 naira per liter ceiling on the price. Given the current dynamics of the oil market, the landing cost of PMS currently is more than the price ceiling. And so what has happened is that the private traders of petroleum products have moved away from the market. But NNPC, given its commitment to ensure availability of petroleum products in the country, it now finds itself the only one remaining in that business of importing and distributing PMS. And in that process, it is incurring losses, what it describes as under recovery. But NNPC has different streams of business. So what happens is that the under recovery on the trading of PMS, washes off against the maybe over recovery or profits on some other lines of their business currently, and that's what it's that's the way it's happening now until we get to a point where we can make some kind of firm decision about how to proceed. But the point to make, however, is whatever decision we come to is that it's only interim. The goal of the administration is to increase domestic refining capacity. When we have sufficient, capacity for domestic refining, some of the cost elements that contribute to the what we call subsidy now will disappear. And so if the products were refined domestically, we would expect costs like transportation, financing costs for the period that it takes from ordering to delivery and all of that, and even the infrastructure cost that is required to manage and handle importation and all of that, the insurances and all of those. There are cost elements that will disappear. And so that really is the focus. So whatever happens to the subsidy or whatever is only an interim measure.
Well, quickly, before we bring this conversation to a close, many Nigerians have expressed concern about extra budgetary spending. Is there a justification for it? Because I guess many people would like to know when, what happens when government spends unappropriated funds. For example, the PDP and former Vice President Atiku Abubakar, they are saying, for example, that trader money was not appropriated for, and it was just, a vote-buying tactic. Is it possible to justify such extra budgetary spending?
Well, I think that anybody who suggests that money spent on trader money is extra budgetary probably hasn't read the budget or doesn't understand it. There is a 500 billion naira provision in the budget. It's been there the last 3 years, every year, for what we call, the social investment program of the government. And trader money is only a small component of that. And, so trader money is provided for in the budget. But what has happened also in terms of the delivery, the mechanism for delivery of trader money, rather than set up another agency or another structure of government, government decided to utilize the Bank of Industry, which already had an arm of it focused on MSMEs, to use that arm to this thing. So, one of the programs under there are 5 programs under the social investment program of government. But one of them is what is called the Government Economic Empowerment Program, GEEP. And trader money, market money, all of those are simply just an element of that, and a small one at that.
Well, very briefly,
so it's not. There's nothing extra budgetary about that.
Let me quickly bring you to this issue, age-long issue of priority of the Nigerian budget. Once again, the 2019 appropriation bill lacks sufficient funding for socio-economic sectors such as the health and education. While education got a paltry 7% of the budget, that of health got around 3%. What, in your own opinion, is this? Is this not a case of misplaced priority? Because remember, also last year, the World Bank had advised that there should be priorities for African countries, including Nigeria, and emerging economy.
Well, first of all, your number on health is wrong. You're probably just picking up the
So what is the number for health in the 2019 budget?
Health. But then, as far as I recall, it's around about 5%, not 3%. But having said that, it's important to understand that both education and health are on what is called the concurrent legislative list, which means that the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments, which all have constitutionally guaranteed revenues, also have obligations to spend on those sectors, and indeed do spend on those sectors. The state, all the 36 state governments have budgets. The Federal Capital Territory Administration has a budget. All of the 774 local governments have annual budgets. And all of these budgets have provisions for education and health. So for you to determine how much Nigeria is spending on those two sectors, you need to aggregate the spending by all the tiers of government. Having said that, I'm not trying to argue that we're spending as much as we should as a country in aggregate. No, we are not there yet. But you see, again, when it comes to take health, for instance, a significant component of our disease burden today is waterborne. Therefore, if you can provide clean water, clean potable water to Nigerians, you would be not just providing water, which is a necessary commodity for life, but you will be addressing health. A significant portion of our disease burden is malaria. Probably kills more than any other. Malaria is about the environment. So when in the budget you spend on the environment or on a cleaner environment, the truth is that you're affecting health outcomes. So it's not just when you look at Ministry of Health, then you try to determine. Oh, in some locations they don't have those challenges. They've long addressed the issue of pipe-borne water, so they don't need to spend on that any longer to affect their health outcomes. Their environments are much cleaner. They don't need to spend on that to address health outcomes. But we can't leave those. As they say, the best health expenditure is preventive. We can't leave some of these things that provide you that preventive capacity and just be spending on the curative part of health just to say that we're meeting a higher percentage for health. When you look at the 2019 budget, for instance, you will see that there's much larger provision that has been made for immunization on two fronts. One, we have a specific provision for immunization in the service-wide vote, which for many years, in the last 10 years, that vote provision has never exceeded like 3.5 billion naira annually. We've moved it to 21 plus billion naira in the 2019 budget. In addition, we have about 55 billion naira provided for what is called the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund. 45% of that money goes to the National Primary Healthcare Development Agency, and that agency will use that primarily for immunization. Immunization has been determined to be able to, that 40%, it's been determined that 40% of the diseases that kill our children, that give us such a high infant mortality rate in this country, can be tackled by immunization. So we understand that we are constrained for resources, to be able for the resources that we need to spend on health, for instance. And what we want to do is be smart to spend in spending those funds. There is a focus on the primary health care. 80% of what takes Nigerians to hospitals can be dealt with at the primary health care level. And that's why the federal government itself is getting more involved in primary health care rather than leave that to the other tiers of government. Because what's important is outcomes affecting health outcomes.
Well, thank you very much.
And that's really ultimately not just about how much you spend. And then the final comment to make is that, we should really, yes, take our own fate into our own hands. But thankfully, for now, we're getting a lot of help from our development partners. If you look at the budget, there is 209 billion naira in that budget for, donor-funded programs, help from, and the bulk of that money is also going to the health sector. In measuring your percentage of spending on health, you haven't captured that. And even in my 5%, I haven't captured that.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ben Akabueze, Director General, Budget Office of the Federation. We wish this conversation could continue for another 1 hour, because you have so much to say, and we've been truly enlightened. We hope that when you finally look at the adjustments that have been done by the National Assembly, we'll get an opportunity to invite you back and that you will honor our invitation. Thank you very much indeed.